Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida, and in this video what I'd like to do is expand Chapter 13 from your text, Profiling Violent Crimes, an investigative tool authored by Holmes and Holmes and published in 2009 by Sage Publications, from Chapter 13 on Jack the Ripper. And then also I want to expand this by adding an article from the Journal of Investigative Psychology and Offender Profiling, Volume 2, pages 1 through 21, titled The Jack the Ripper Murders, a Modus Operandi of the Signature Analysis of the 1888 to 1892 Whitechapel Murders. And that is authored by Keppel, Weiss, Brown, and Welch in 2005. And what Keppel et al. Do is they conduct a linkage analysis or signature analysis, and they link the crimes, and they analyze Jack the Ripper crimes with and compare with other homicides that occurred during that time period, and try to develop, and they actually do develop a model using signature analysis that Jack the Ripper most likely killed a specific number of victims, and then the other victims that had been killed around the same time period were probably killed by someone else. So we'll get right to that. Basically, if we look at the case notes from the profiling textbook, between August and November of 1888, 5 to 8 women were killed in the London area that are believed to be victims of Jack the Ripper. And of course, it's very contested still, as no arrests were ever made, who Jack the Ripper was and how many victims he actually had. But Holmes and also Keppel et al. Do look at the victim histories and look at the personal history, the criminal background, residence and locations, the night of the killing, as well as medical reports. And so that is definitely helpful information to have. What we have is the Whitechapel section of East End, London, where the murders occurred. And in this area at that particular time, we had a lot of overcrowding, unemployment, disease, and other social problems. So it was an area where there was a lot of crime and a lot of problems going on. And if we start looking at the victims, the first victim discussed is Ann Nichols. And she is believed to be the Ripper's first victim. She was a prostitute who had been separated from her husband when she was killed. Nichols had a lengthy police record and also lived in a public lodging house, and there's a lot of social problems around that area. Her body was found illuminated by one street light, and the medical report stated that she had 5 teeth missing, a tear in her tongue, bruises on her throat and face, 3 incisions in her neck, incisions across her stomach, and no blood found on her body. So what we learn here is that this particular serial murderer was pretty meticulous with what he was or she was doing. It's believed to be, most believe that Jack the Ripper, Jack being male, but can we rule out that Jack the Ripper wasn't female? I don't want to go ahead and speculate too much, but I'll go ahead and refer to Jack the Ripper as male, even though that has not been verified with certainty as far as I can tell. Annie Chapman, the second victim, lived in public housing and also was a prostitute, also sold flowers and her crochet. She had terminal illness at the time of her murder, and she did not have an extensive criminal background. She was kicked out of the lodging on the night of her murder because she wasn't able to pay, and she was disemboweled. Her uterus was removed, 1 kidney was removed, the intestines were severed and placed over her shoulder. The upper parts of the vagina and parts of her bladder were also removed. So we can see the second victim had some characteristics of the first. but we see more details of information about cutting out parts of the body. The third victim, Elizabeth Stride, was 45 years old when she was murdered, and she also earned money from prostitution and also sewing and housekeeping. She lived in common lodging, did not have an extensive criminal background. Her throat had been cut, and it appeared that her killer had tried to cut off her head, but was either unable to do so or was interrupted by someone and left the scene. The fourth victim of Jack the Ripper was 46 years old when she died. This is Catherine Eddowes. Eddowes lived in public housing, did not have an extensive criminal background. Her body was found in a square in front of 3 empty cottages. Her face had been mutilated, the tip of her nose cut off, her throat was cut, part of her ear was cut off, her kidney and uterus were taken from the crime scene. Parts of her womb were also taken by the killer, and her intestines were severed and placed over her right shoulder. So we see a lot of similarities with several of the other cases now. The fifth victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was seen with Eddowes the day before her death. Kelly had no extensive criminal history, had a room on a particular street and made money from prostitution. Her body was found in her bed, nude. The skin on her stomach and thighs were removed, her breasts were cut off, and her arms were mutilated. Her face was also mutilated. Her nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears were partially removed, and her heart had been taken from the crime scene. So how many victims do we have? Keppel, Weiss, Brown, and Welch added another one, Martha Tabram, to the Ripper victims. And so in addition to the ones discussed by Holmes and Holmes, we also have this one added. And Martha Tabram was a prostitute and heavy drinker, around 36 years old at the time of death. Her legs were open and exposed. She had 39 stab wounds, around 39 stab wounds, including multiple wounds to her breasts and genitals from either a knife or a dagger. So Keppel and colleagues evaluated 11 murders between 1988 and 1981, which may or may not have been committed by the same killer, and they conducted signature analysis. Those are the ones that are believed to be victims of Jack the Ripper. And of course, there is the attempt to profile Jack the Ripper. And Holmes and Holmes offer that he was a white male, probably around 5'7", around 28 to 36 years old, wore a long dark coat, had a mustache, lived or worked in the Whitechapel area, and had a strong dislike for prostitutes. So that's kind of the profile that we see. That doesn't really narrow things down too much. And then we see much later on, and more recently, of course, attempts to conduct DNA analysis and matching, and there's still a lot of debate about that. And so, like I said, various profiles have been offered, and the information has not been really helpful in determining who the perpetrator was. Now, if we look at how Jack the Ripper operated, well, he went after prostitutes in the Whitechapel area. The prostitutes tended to be around 24 to 45 years old. The murders took place between midnight and 6 in the morning within a 1 mile square area. Now that's really relevant when you start looking at time frames, and also the locations and how far apart they are or how close they are. It looked like the women were strangled and then lowered to the ground and then had their throats cut, and then other mutilations took place. It appears that Jack the Ripper used a sharpened, very sharp, long knife, and most of the attacks occurred outdoors, and then the killer moved the bodies indoors when that was possible, and that's from Keppel's work. If we look at the signature characteristics, and this is where we really start to link and match things up, that we and Keppel et al. Point out these characteristics. which really kind of lead us to the ability to match up those particular murders. That, for example, that the victims were stabbed, cut, and sliced. There was overkill, and the victims appeared to have been killed very quickly. The perpetrator wanted to show domination, power, and control over the victims, and the perpetrator also displayed the bodies in unusual ways. On their back with their legs open, often their clothes and their body parts were arranged by the killer. It appeared that he was organized around a sexualized violence of the victims, also leaving them in sexually degrading positions and on display for others to see when they passed by. We also saw mutilation of bodies and organ removal, and also specific areas of the body were attacked. So it also appears that these attacks were planned and organized, and the murderer brought the weapon to the crime scene but avoided detection and left really no evidence. So these factors, in looking at signature characteristics, links Jack the Ripper to the 6 murders that I discussed earlier, and this is what Keppel and his colleagues discuss and describe. So in conclusion, the identity of Jack the Ripper still remains a mystery, although there's been several suspects proposed, and there's been several books and articles written about who Jack the Ripper might be. Also, the killer's signature characteristics remain consistent, while his needs and desires seem to become more stronger and more violent. For example, with the later organ removal situation. As I mentioned, recent DNA tests have been done on, but the results have been inconclusive, and the search for the identity of Jack the Ripper continues. And perhaps from a profiling perspective, we might think about so many years later, what data or information would be helpful to perhaps resolving this case. And it seems that we'll have to wait and see if there's any new technological advances that help, or if there's any discoveries that occur that provide us more information. For example, a letter is discovered or found, or there's some writing by someone who knew Jack the Ripper and could describe in great detail what happened, or Jack the Ripper themselves. And it's unlikely this debate will be resolved in the near future, as far as I can tell, but it's a very interesting case to study. There's recently been an interest in writing about the victims and the importance of also focusing attention on the women who were victimized by this very sadistic killer. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.